welcome everyone to the virtual world of the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director. We have a special event today in partnership with our friends at the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, with whom we've had a great relationship and doing wonderful things together. Their library now lives with us. And I know Sally Sudo is here with us today, and Sally facilitated our giving the library a new home, which is wonderful and being used. This is our Day of Remembrance event, the anniversary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's executive order arresting Japanese Americans. What we're going to do today is have a brief presentation from Frank Abe about the history of Day of Remembrance. We're going to have a PowerPoint from Karen Lucas about Camp Savage and Fort Snelling and the M.I.S. I hope that you've all taken advantage of the access provided to the film The Registry, because the next thing we will do is have a panel discussion about that film with the two filmmakers and Seiki Oshiro, who was in the film. And then we will have the opportunity for audience members to ask questions. We'd like to start out by asking you to put questions or comments into the chat, and we will track those and pass them along to the panelists. And hopefully things will unfold in a comfortable enough way that will then invite everyone to unmute and participate a little bit more informally. For the duration of the formal program, we ask you all to keep your microphones muted. After 2 years of Zoom, I've certainly come to prefer that people leave their video on so that we're not talking to black boxes. That is, of course, your choice, but we'd love to see you. And that is the plan for today's program. And I especially want to thank our friends at the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League for suggesting this program and for organizing it. After Frank speaks, I will be introducing Vinny, the president of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, who will share some words with us on their behalf. So let me briefly introduce Frank. He's the kind of person that I could give a longer introduction of him than his talk would be. But for nearly 2 decades, Frank has been instrumental in recovering the story of the largest organized resistance to the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. He helped produce the very first Day of Remembrance media events. He helped found the Asian American Theater Workshop in San Francisco, and has been a broadcast journalist on the West Coast, a reporter for KIRO News Radio in Seattle, and really helping our neighbors and friends understand the complexities of the Japanese American experience. So I'm thrilled to have Frank with us, and he's going to give us a setting in the history of Day of Remembrance. Frank, please.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. This is the second year I've had the honor of joining Eastside Freedom Library in Twin Cities JCL for a Day of Remembrance program. I got to say, just the idea of a freedom library is so inspiring to hear and to learn about your roots in the civil rights movement and the connections with freedom and justice ideals. So yes, I was part of the first Day of Remembrance. We've been observing Days of Remembrance now for so long that people can be forgiven for kind of taking it for granted, for thinking that we've always had it, or that we've observed it for the 80 years since the executive order was signed. And by the way, this is the 80th anniversary today. of the signing of Executive Order 9066 by President Roosevelt. But the Day of Remembrance is actually an invented tradition. And let me just take 4 minutes to show you a little bit of how it came about. So this is the group that organized the first Day of Remembrance. The origins came in 1978 from the need to build popular support behind the burgeoning call for redress and reparations for the camps. Leadership came from the Seattle chapter of the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League. And Vinny, you're too young to know this, but I took it as a kind of a badge of honor that Seattle was disparaged at the time as the so-called Maverick chapter of JACL. This was the poster that we put up on telephone poles. We tacked this up on telephone poles and in bowling alleys, just like the Western Defense Command posters in 1942. And the designs superimposed, as you can see, over a ghost image of the original Instructions to All Persons poster, with language that's calibrated to signal that this was not just a commemoration. And the operative words are on top. Remember the concentration camps, stand for redress with your family. So that people knew what they were kind of signing up for when they attended. Now, the poster invited people to join us in dramatizing the eviction from Seattle with a car caravan down Interstate 5 to our hometown concentration camp, if you will, at the Western Washington Fairgrounds, the site of the old Puyallup Assembly Center. So we branded it with a logo, a stylized Ichi-Ni-San family crest, 3 generations of Japanese America united within a circle, but wrapped with the barbed wire. A very effective design, still used today. We had a sense that people were interested, but nothing prepared me for this scene when I arrived that morning, November 25th, in the parking lot of the Seattle Pilots baseball stadium and found hundreds of cars waiting for us with close to 1,000 people eager to register for the event. It really felt like the entire community poured out to remember the camps and stand for redress with their families. So many people showed up, we struggled to sign everyone in. It may have been, in fact, the largest single gathering of Japanese Americans in Seattle since World War II. Comedian Pat Morita came out to speak, show his support, as did the Academy Award-winning actor Mako. We issued replicas of the family number tags for people to tie to their clothing. I could be wrong, but this may have been the first such event to dramatize the expulsion with, mock family number tags. Energy was so electric that Seattle JACL's Ben Nakagawa, pictured here, got the governor's office to arrange an escort of military trucks for our convoy. So, led by the National Guard, the line of cars stretched down Interstate 5 so far as the eye could see. And inside the cars, something unexpected happened. The physical memory of being forced to leave Seattle in 1942, just the memory of that, the sense memory, triggered something inside the Nisei. Parents opened up to their children about what happened to them during the war, many for the first time. Anthropologist Yasuko Takazawa has called this the event that burst open the tomb of Japanese American history. And we gained national media coverage in print and on TV. So what the first Day of Remembrance did was to shift the public narrative, to get the media and the public opinion on our side. And what people feared most at that time never happened. There was no white backlash, no angry mob, no rekindling of old resentments and racism. So I've been pleased to see Days of Remembrance continue to be observed, for the past 44 years. And from that day to today, it was so meaningful to see Vice President Kamala Harris deliver a personal statement last night acknowledging this 80th anniversary of the executive order. So yes, we've come a long way. Now, that, in brief, the story of the first Day of Remembrance, which brings us all here in this room today. I wish I could stay in conversation with you longer, but as I told Peter, I have to kind of jump off now. I have several other events to attend today, so I must leave you now. So welcome today. This program is focused on the story of the Military Intelligence Service in Minnesota. And as Peter said, I hope you've seen the Registry, Bill Kubota and Steve's fine film, in which I have a small appearance, talking about the story of the M.I.S. service of author John Okada, who was living in Detroit when he wrote the groundbreaking novel called No Boy. So if you haven't seen the film, please do take a look. Thank you, Vinny. Thank you, John, for that your comments there, and thank you, Peter. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Frank, and good luck with your other endeavors today, and stay well. Thank you. We look forward to at least seeing you next year for Day of Remembrance.
Happy to.
I'm going to turn things over now to Vinny Taguchi from the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, who is going to be our host going forward. Vinny?
All right, thank you, Peter. Boy, Frank is a tough act to follow, so I'll try to keep my comments brief. But my name is Vinny Taguchi. I have the distinct privilege of serving as the current president of the Twin Cities chapter of the JCL, and it's my pleasure to be a part of this exciting event today, where we remember the proud legacy of the vibrant Twin Cities Japanese American community. We talked about this is the 80th anniversary of the executive order that kind of got the whole thing started. And to this day, we're still remembering and wrestling with what that means, the history of everything that has happened so far, how we got to this point, but also looking forward, how this story continues to be important to the Japanese American experience as we look forward. So that's enough from me. I want to hand it over to our exciting panelists who are, well, we have both of the filmmakers that were involved in creating the film that you all hopefully had a chance to watch, and a lot of other exciting people to hear from.
So we're going to start with Karen Lucas, who has put together a slideshow for us about Camp Savage and Fort Snelling. Karen is a third-generation Japanese American born in post-war occupied Japan, where her father was stationed with the U.S. Military Intelligence Service. She's been a board member with Twin Cities JACL since 2008, and particularly active on their education committee. She's worked with the Minnesota Historical Society about trying to get the history and legacy of the M.I.S. recognized at Fort Snelling and other public spaces. And we've enjoyed working with her at the Freedom Library and are excited to watch her slideshow today. Go ahead, Karen.
I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Right. All right. Can you see this okay?
Looks great.
Okay, super. So at the start of the Registry, the film, Seiki Oshiro asks the question, who's going to remember us when we're gone? When we're all gone? Maybe someone, some kid, our grandkids. We'll find out that we're in here and what we did during the war. Today is our day of remembrance. And it also happens to be my dad's birthday, February 19th. So in remembering the Military Intelligence Service and the language school, I remember my father, Walter Tanaka, who would have been 104 years old today. When I moved to Minnesota in 1970, I had no idea that my father had ever been here, not to mention that he trained with some secret school during World War II, because this was still a classified military secret. This is a picture of my dad standing next to his father and his two brothers before the war on the farm. So my dad had been drafted in 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese American community in his small town held a banquet and a proud send-off for Dad and the other Nisei draftees. And Nisei is the word for second generation Japanese Americans, because their country signaled to them in this act that they were wanted, needed, and accepted, unlike their immigrant fathers who by law could never become Americans. Dad had already completed training in heavy weapons combat infantry and was stationed at Fort Ord in California by the time the war broke out. The week after Pearl Harbor, he was manning a machine gun post on a beach north of San Francisco, guarding the coast. At that time, there were almost 5,000 Nisei in the US Army. Many of them were summarily discharged at the start of the war without cause. The rest were disarmed, sent inland, and assigned to labor details, often doing the work formerly assigned to prisoners. Dad was sent to Fort Custer to shovel coal into furnaces. Two things happened while my dad was at Fort Custer. One is his family was rounded up and incarcerated in one of the World War II American concentration camps for people of Japanese ancestry. The second thing that happened was that Dad was tested and selected for the MISLS, the Military Intelligence Service Language School in Savage, Minnesota. The MISLS had its origins in the 4th Army Intelligence School in the city of San Francisco in 1941, in November, a month before war broke out. The school's founders screened thousands of soldiers for Japanese language proficiency and found that Caucasian linguists were extremely rare. So they selected 58 Nisei and 2 Caucasians for their first class of 60. By the time this first class graduated in May of 1942, war had broken out, and some were sent to places like Guadalcanal in the South Pacific. They proved their worth in interrogating prisoners and translating captured documents, and the demand for linguists started. But the school could not continue in San Francisco because of the exclusion of everyone of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast, and it had to be moved inland. The military commanders of the school were unable to find a state that would even take them due to hostility towards anyone of Japanese ancestry, until the school finally opened in June of 1942, welcomed by then Governor Harold Stassen and the people of Minnesota. Dad was in the first class of 200 students who trained in Minnesota. 160 of them were Nisei. Since Fort Snelling was at capacity processing new recruits for the war, Governor Stassen offered 132 acres of state-owned land that had formerly been used as a home for elderly indigent men in Savage, which was within a dozen miles of the fort. Many Nisei soldiers came from families who had lost businesses and homes with the mass incarceration. So it was a stinging reminder when the early arrivals were greeted at Camp Savage by a sign made out of white rocks spelling out homeless men's shelter. Dad and a friend at Camp Savage are shown in this picture here. What's notable here is not that Dad passed that selection test, but that 90% of the Nisei did not, because like my dad, who in grade school sometimes was the only Japanese American in his class, the Nisei went to American public schools with classmates and teachers who spoke English. They had become Americanized. But during the Depression, my dad was pulled out of school for 4 years to work on the farm. He graduated 4 years late, but he kind of got a version of language immersion homeschooling. His Kyoto-born and educated mother spoke a high standard form of Japanese, rather than a rural dialect, which gave him an advantage. This is a picture of morning roll call at Camp Savage. The daily schedule involved classes all day, breaks for meals, and then required studying from about 7 to 9 at night. The school based its course on a 3-year curriculum that was condensed down into 6 months. Due to the rigors of the subject and having to learn all the military terms, as well as memorize 15 of those complex kanji characters daily, many of them pored over flashcards and texts in the latrines at night because it was the only place where lights stayed on after 11 o'clock. As the demand for Nisei linguists escalated and no more qualified Nisei could be culled from the existing enlisted men, the Army started recruiting from inside the concentration camps and from Hawaii. These men came straight as civilians into the M.I.S. and they had no prior military basic training, and yet they could be sent to the front, and they needed to know how to handle a weapon, how to take orders, and these were very physically and psychologically demanding trainings. These fresh recruits had to go to basic training after they completed their 6 months at Camp Savage. The M.I.S. graduates joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. This was the segregated all Japanese American combat team, the 442nd, which then joined the 100th segregated battalion and fought in some of the most grueling battles in Italy, France, and Germany. There were 18,000 Nisei who served in what became the most highly decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. The linguists trained at Camp Savage accompanied combat troops in every major landing in the Pacific. So there's my dad, second from the right. Harry Fudena was in my dad's class, and he was on the same 10-man air technical team that Dad was assigned to. Harry listened to radio signal communications that resulted in the shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto, who was the commander of the combined Imperial Japanese fleet during World War II. The M.I.S. grads later went on to translate the famous Z plan. These were captured battle plans, which outlined Japan's entire air and naval defense for the South Pacific. These intelligence coups prompted General MacArthur to state, never in military history did an army know so much about the enemy prior to actual engagement. This is my dad kneeling on the ground with linguist George Kimura, identifying a fragment of fuselage from a downed Japanese aircraft in New Guinea in 1944. These were the top linguists in my dad's class. And 4 of them accompanied Allied units along the jungle tracks in MacArthur's New Guinea campaign, doing on-the-spot interrogation of captured POWs and getting real-time intelligence. 2 of them translated a captured Japanese map that completely exposed the entire plan of defense of a Japanese base on New Guinea to the attacking Americans. The other 2 got a captured Japanese POW to reveal critical air target sites by tricking him into believing that this town had already fallen. Within hours, these strategic sites were bombed. Before this type of intelligence was available, Allied units were caught off guard when they stumbled across Japanese strongholds in the dense jungle, or misjudged their strength, or fell prey to ambush attacks. This was November of 1942, around the time of graduation from Camp Savage. Dad shipped out to serve in prisoner interrogation with ATIS, A-T-I-S, which stands for Allied Translator and Interpreter Service in Australia, as well as with ADATIS, which is Advanced ATIS in New Guinea. He served in the Philippines and in occupied Japan and later with the counterintelligence. ATIS was MacArthur's Allied Centralized Intelligence Center for the Southwest Pacific, for the translation of intercepted Japanese communication, documents, and interrogation shared across all services and all the Allied countries. And ATIS, as I said, was on the front line embedded with troops. At its height of operation in 1945, almost 4,000 linguists were employed with ATIS, most of whom were trained here at Savage or Fort Snelling. They interrogated 14,000 prisoners and translated 2 million documents during World War II. Camp Savage trained 1,800 linguists before the school was moved to Fort Snelling in August of 44. And Japan surrendered in August of 45, but even more linguists were needed for the occupation of Japan, which continued until April of 1952. By the time Fort Snelling closed in June of 1946, a total of 6,000 linguists had been trained by the M.I.S. LS, and the vast majority of these were Japanese American. Seiki's registry seeks to correct the omission that little or no official records were kept on these men for much of what they did. We are here today to remember.
Thank you, Karen. That was wonderful. There were some questions already raised in the chat. We'll try to keep track of them, posing questions to Karen about these magnificent images and great stories. Thank you. We're now going to turn to a panel about the film, The Registry. Steve Ozone is going to moderate the panel as well as being part of it. Steve is a photographer and filmmaker, formerly a commercial photographer. Now his work focuses not only on projects like The Registry, but also documenting the lives of immigrants coming to Minnesota from various places. We can see his photographs outside of the Silver Ramp at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. Steve is also, comes from a very interesting personal history. His mom being Japanese, his dad's family being Chinese American. Did I get that right,
Yeah,
Steve?
it's the other way around.
Other way around, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But that this has also drawn his interest to another undertold story in American history, the story of Paper Sons and the restrictions on Chinese immigration to the US, all experiences that, whatever background we come from, are relevant to understanding the country and the culture that we live in today. Steve will be joined on the panel by his filmmaking partner on The Registry, Bill Kubota, who's joining us today, the magic of Zoom, joining us from Detroit. In 2007, Bill directed the national primetime documentary for PBS entitled Most Honorable Son, about a Japanese American who had served in the US Army Air Corps in World War II. He also served as co-producer and director of photography of the DuPont Columbia award-winning documentary series, Beyond the Light Switch, in 2011. And he too is working today capturing and presenting the experiences of diverse immigrants dealing with housing, immigration, and mass incarceration in his current home city of Detroit. And Steve and Bill will be joined by Seiki Oshiro on the panel. We would not be here today talking about The Registry if were not for the work that Seiki has done over these many years to create this documentation. Seiki was born in Hawaii, on a sugar plantation town. He attended Japanese language school 6 days a week for 7 years, and ultimately became involved with the M.I.S. Himself. And as I said to him, he is such a compelling person in the film that he could have had a career as a Hollywood actor. So I'm delighted that Steve and Bill and Seiki will share some comments and thoughts with us. And again, I encourage you, if something pops into your head that you want to express right away, please type it into the chat, and we will move into more of a discussion format after the panel. So I'm going to turn things over to Steve.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Karen, for that great presentation. First thing I'd like to say is that Bill and I are cousins. So we've known each other our whole lives. Bill's mother and father were incarcerated, and my father was also. So my father and Bill's mother are brother and sister. So I'm going to have Bill tell you about about how the idea for the film came about, and then I'll talk a little bit about meeting Seiki and where we went from there. So Bill, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. I'd done this film that we mentioned called Most Honorable Son about a guy from Nebraska, a Nisei, who was in the Army Air Corps. He actually was probably one of the most famous Japanese Americans if you were looking at the media or the news stories back during the war. There were very few. A couple of like Tokyo Rose and stuff like that. But this guy was an actual bona fide war hero in the air, flying over Europe and Japan in bombers. But after doing that, then Steve was doing some a project with the Twin City JCL documenting oral histories, and he asked me to help him do that. So I came out to Minnesota and we met some folks and thought, what else can we do related to what's going on in Minnesota? I always knew the M.I.S. was there. I didn't know if there were a lot of people still around from those days. Turns out there were, but I wanted to do another story about Japanese Americans in the Midwest. You know, we hear so many stories from the coasts, the West Coast basically, but why can't we tell more of our stories? So I started looking at online and you know, there's some folks here and there's some storylines that we can track, but the main one is this guy coming up on this in the internet. There's some guy named Seiki Oshiro, and I go, Steve, you know who this guy is? He's got a whole list of these people, and he's in Minnesota. You know, let's get a hold of him. And then when that happened, we kind of knew we probably had the basis for a film, and that's where this thing all started. But it was great because here's this Hawaiian guy in Minnesota, so that's kind of how this all went. And then it took a while to make the film, a few years. We got a grant from the National Park Service because they do a lot of projects trying to preserve the history of the internment. And we knew that was a good jumping off point to use that as part of the basis for the film, because a lot of the guys that are in the film, in fact, in our film, most of them are stateside, even though a lot of the Japanese Americans in M.I.S. were from Hawaii. You know, ours was looking at, you know, some of the folks that we could get to because it cost some money to go to Hawaii, although we did go there. So that's how this all came about. And I wanted us to tell a story that's not one of guys sitting in chairs, wearing baseball hats, talking about what happened back then. We wanted to tell a story of guys basically who grew up trying to tell their story to the people today. So we kind of track people, if you watch, there's people still active. And most all of them we've lost now because we were shooting that 10 years ago. But that was a kind of an active story of what the Nisei vets were doing at that moment in their 90s, still up and at it. So it's not, our film is more kind of a personal look at some lives, a few lives, trying to tell the story of all their lives through those few people that we focused on. And that's what we got. So if you saw it, you can kind of get that idea. It's kind of a different kind of historical film. So Steve can probably tell you a little bit more about that, but from his perspective, because that's what I wanted to do, because the last film I did was really a lot of vets talking about the old days, but I wanted to have more talking about today too, you know.
And so this was the first film I had ever made, and and it was great that it worked out like this. So so after Bill asked me about this guy named Seiki, I called him up and went to his house, and he showed me all this research material that he had been doing for years. And we talked, and then I thought that there was a good story there because he had spent so much time on it. Ironically, he lived in Savage, and Savage was where the first the M.I.S. LS school was located. So he, without purposely moving to Savage, he ended up right there, really close to it. And so, as Bill said, we decided it was a good story, applied for a grant, and then we started shooting. And we spent so much time with Seiki that when Seiki's wife, Vicky, was still alive, the last time we saw them, we probably went there 10 times in 7 years. Both of them said, "We don't want to see you again until the film is done." They were so tired of us. So we did finish it, and I was talking to Bill the other day about it. We've shown the film 25 times within the state of Minnesota and at different film festivals around the country. So I'm going to pass it on to Seiki, and he's going to tell you about how he got started on his work. So Seiki, go ahead.
Okay. I got to tell you the story about the registry. The registry was listed without the word registry. It was a list of graduates of the M.I.S. beginning in 1941, November 41, and ending in November of 1945. And there were in that list of graduates 5,704 graduates of all ethnicities. But the list was very strange. Their names were in family name first, and then also only. And that's what hit us really hard when we saw that list like that. It's 10 pages of that book called the MISLS album, printed in 1941 by the
It's the U.S. Army, right?
say again?
The U.S. Army.
I didn't get that.
It was printed by the U.S. Army, wasn't it?
No, I don't think so. It was some strange Tennessee outfit, but together with the with the War Department. And that's the book. It's a rare book now. You can't find it in most libraries, but Minnesota Historical Society have one. And that's the book I got the copies of all the graduates for those years. The word registry came about from the lead of the work that we were doing, Grant Ichikawa. He wanted to show that these peoples were real people, and we want to tell the families that they were there in that school. So Grant is the one that generated the word registry. Now, what happened was the school closed in 46, June of 46, and then they transferred it to Presidio of Monterey in June 16th, 1946. And then they began to generate more graduates. So we followed that lead because there were graduates from DLI as well. We continued to collect the names and added to the original 5,700 names. So we now have a registry of over 8,000 names, both who were trained by the War Department at Camp Savage, Fort Snelling, and DLI at Presidio of Monterey. So that's what we have now. After November of 1945, the M.I.S. Fort Snelling continued to train linguists, and they had about 3,800 of them still remaining in the schools. So they transferred out 872 to Presidio of Monterey, and then another 792 to Japan, occupation of Japan. So we have today a long list of linguists entering Japan. And in July of 1945, they transferred another group of people who were familiar with the language. And it is the 100 battalions and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. There were some people there who were familiar with the language, transferred to Fort Snelling to continue their Japanese training. Now, the graduates of both of these schools were cleared for security before they were deployed to overseas area. And the US Army picked the places where they were going. And the places are CBI, China, Burma, India, and CONUS, continental US, Byron Hot Spring POW camp in California, and then Camp Ritchie, Maryland, Pentagon in DC, and then places like Fulton Fish Market, New York City. All of these trained linguists were stationed all over places like that in Pacific area. CPA, Central Pacific area, and it was in Okinawa, Hawaii, and then other Pacific area, Central Pacific area, Southwest Pacific area, Australia, New Guinea, East Indies, Philippines, and parts of Central Pacific area. A group called JICPOA Annex, Mandated Islands, Iwo Jima, Alaskan Command, CONUS, VHFS, Vint Hill Farm Station in Warrenton, Virginia, and then CONUS Pacific Military Intelligence Section, Pentagon, and Camp Ritchie, Maryland. So those are the places they were all sent out after their graduation. And also, if you take a look at that flowchart, AJA population distribution flowchart, if you look at the 1940 census data, there were 150,905 Japanese in the territory of Hawaii, and 126,947 Japanese in Franklin Roosevelt's EO 9066 picked up 1,500 in the Hawaiian Islands or territory of Hawaii. And then in the US, they picked up 120,313 in the WRA camps west of the Mississippi. They picked up also Department of Justice camps in Idaho, Louisiana, Montana, North Dakota, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Texas. Texas had 110,000 2,200 Japanese Peruvian from Peru. Now, somebody has to tell me what right Franklin Roosevelt had to extract Japanese from South America.
I will say that
So
that's another story we should do, right, Seiki? But hey, you know,
yes.
what about you went somewhere, right? Where were you? Where did you get stationed?
I got stationed. I was asked to volunteer in my high school days, and the people who came to recruit me was from M.I.S. in Honolulu, and they said, if you volunteer, you will get the GI Bill. And I wasn't thinking about my schoolings, but I said, gee, that's a good deal for me to go and get my education through the GI Bill. So I enlisted. And when I enlisted, they said, your ordinary enlistment duration in basic training was 16 weeks. And the guy says, we're going to cut your basic training to 16 weeks. So that's what happened to us. In Schofield Barracks, they trained us for 6 weeks and they rushed us over to Yokohama. And that's how I got to Yokohama, Japan.
Well, Seiki, you were in the Big Island, right? You were in
I was on-
Lapahoehoe.
That's correct. That was my high school. That's right.
And the one thing that you did, and a lot of Nisei, once they went to Tokyo after the war, and it's not talked about, and we didn't have time to do this in our film, and I knew we were going to, and we never did. This really shaped the Japan of today. The Nisei were the ones that were the interface between General MacArthur and the Japanese people. And they probably don't get enough credit for that sort of thing. Maybe you weren't directly involved in a lot of it, but I know you know the stories.
Yes, I do know the story. Somebody recently sent me a declassified list of people who helped MacArthur do his work. And this is the ATIS group, Allied Translators and Interpreters Section.
Oh, we lost you.
Seiki, your mic's off. Are you talking too fast and we can't hear you? I wanted to know, when we did this film, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know that much about M.I.S. other than the basic conventional stuff. But I kind of didn't want to know too much, because sometimes we do too much research, you get really deep into it and you realize there's no way we can put this on film. And but that's why I wanted to do more about this whole part of the whole thing with Addis and what happened after the war. And that's why even with Seiki telling us about, there was a big communist insurgency going on after the war in Japan. And I learned a little bit about that, right? You were involved with that, with the intelligence there.
I was in Addis waiting to be assigned at that time. This was 1946 and 47. And we were just sitting and waiting. And I think we were waiting for my clearance from the group I was in. And it was the 441st CIC detachment. That's where I was sitting and waiting before I was fully assigned. Well,
right, Seiki, before you, what is CIC?
Counterintelligence Corps. That's the unit I was sent into. But I was waiting for my security. And then the communists, labor union, and these were released POW from Siberia. Russians have captured Manchuria in the middle of our occupation of Japan, and they took us back into Siberia near Lake Baikal, and then they were indoctrinating them to do harm to the U.S. in the occupation. So we were watching over these people. That was our job. But when some of the labor unions had some communists infiltrated, and they pulled on a strike on February 1st, 1947. And MacArthur said, this is detrimental to the Japanese people. So he banned the strike. But before he could send out the troops to pick up all the people. They were asking for volunteers to go out and pick out all the labor leaders. So when the time came to strike, the strike leaders backed off because we were ready to arrest them. And the strike was put off and everything was quiet. But the communists, we've never seen them again. They disappeared someplace. They left the country. We didn't see them anymore. That's what happened. That was my first experience in the CIA work, CIC work.
Seiki, there's a question from in the chat. Mark Matsunaga, who wants to know, did your 6 weeks of training at Schofield include time at AMGLS?
No.
AMGLS, yeah.
Allied
What does
military-
the abbreviation stand for, and how many Nisei were trained there?
They were Allied military government training class. It was at Schofield Barracks. I was not in it. My 6 weeks was strictly basic training.
You know, one more thing about the post-war Japan, I think pretty much every Nisei we put in our film and others we talked to, most everybody got sent to Tokyo after the war, except for one guy. All the rest of them did. And I'm seeing from Karen Matsumoto, who's here. I don't know if she wants to talk about this, but her dad, Roy Matsumoto, he's the guy that if there was one M.I.S. guy that should have got the Medal of Honor, it was him. But she probably could tell us a story too about his experience in post-war Japan. I don't know if we can get her up here, but it's we weren't able to do a whole lot on that part of the story either in the film. But this is kind of important stuff that we kind of left out, you know.
Yeah, here's the story on that. All the Niseis were put into one group, no matter where they came from. And this happened in Manila. When MacArthur was in Manila, the ATIS group got all of the Nisei linguists who were positioned in the war zone. They got them all in one group. And this was the group that was moved into Tokyo. And this is how most Niseis got involved with ATIS.
Speaking of Karen Matsumoto, she has a question, but I did, before I ask you, I just wanted to acknowledge the people that are from the film that are attending today. So I haven't seen Patrick Doi, but he's Terry Doi's son. Karen Matsumoto, of course. Brian Ichikawa, Linda Tamura, and Nico Yasui. I see Nico, and Bill's mom, Toby Kubota, and his brother, Bob. Oh, and I also, Seiki, I wanted to tell you, I contacted Terry Shima, who was also in our film. He's 99 years old, but he wanted to let you know that he fully supports you, and he wanted to say hi. Sorry he couldn't make it.
Also, Bill's daughter, Peggy Doi, is here. Bill Doi's daughter.
Bill Doyce, yeah. So let's see. Here's a question from Karen Matsumoto. Seiki, how many MISLers were Kibe? And who are Kibe?
I don't have that statistics.
Can you talk about who the Kibe were?
Oh, the definition of a kibe, yes.
Yes.
The kibe are persons who are sent to Japan by their parents to study the Japanese language, to be familiar with it. And it stands for, when they returned to America, they were the ones that really knew the Japanese language. It's called returned Japanese from after studying Japanese in Japan.
Okay, thank you. And here's another question. This is from Linda Tamura. She's a historian, and she was in our film talking about Frank Hachia. Her question is, so many MISers chose to keep their secrets about their wartime experience. What would you tell their descendants, many who know so little?
Those of us who had sensitive assignments were told to keep their mouths shut. And I am one of them. At the time of my discharge, before they handed me my discharge paper, the officer said, "You cannot talk about your experience." So that's how I kept my mouth shut all along. And in my life, when my kids used to ask me, "What did you do?" I said, "I push pencils." That's what I told her. I just had to keep my mouth shut.
And that became the point of our film, to ask because we thought that the non-communication about what their parents did was because the parents didn't think they wanted to know, their children didn't want to know what they did, and the children didn't know what questions to ask. But that's not what you felt.
Yes, I was directed, the last voice command this officer gave me was, I can't talk about that stuff I did in CIC, Counterintelligence Corps. That's what happened to me, yes.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question from Miss Westby. Did the Kibe return before the war? And did they have any problems entering the US?
Oh, yes. The Kibe who served in the military of the Japanese Army or Navy. At first, MacArthur had the rule that said anyone who had served in the Imperial Army or Navy, they were banned from returning to the US. The words that I used to hear was persona non grata. But some lawyers got together and they talked MacArthur out of that policy. And some of them were able to return after the war to their home in US. Persona non grata. Now there's some additional ones to that group. Some of them did not serve in the Japanese Imperial Forces. And they were young enough during the occupation of Japan. MacArthur allowed them to join the US Army. So there were a small group of Niseis who studied in Japan, was able to join the US Army and retrain in the US Army military methods. And with their language power, they were back into service in Japan. Yes.
And the Kibe were born in America.
Yes, the Kibe were born in America.
Mhm.
So they were able to return to their family in
Yes.
the US. Yes.
Can I talk a little bit more about the Kibe? Because, you know, when we were working on the, at least for me, Steve probably knew it all already, but we were interviewing one of our guys, Masanosha in Arizona. He's no longer with us either, but he was the one to tell us the Kibe were the most effective guys in the M.I.S. from his point of view, because they knew everything about Japanese culture, where M.I.S, you know, he grew up in the West Coast. He, you know, he wasn't that steeped in Japanese stuff like the Kibe were, but the Kibe, a lot of them, they were treated so terribly when they were going to school in Japan. They hated the Japanese. That's what he told us, you know, because they were Americans and they were mistreated by the Japanese. So, in fact, that was the story with Terry Doi, who was the hero on Iwo Jima, that he knows. So, in fact, that was the real story. Was, I think he was actually at one point in the Japanese military when they were digging the tunnels in Iwo Jima. Was back in America when the war started, became an American GI, and he knew the ins and outs of that island, and that's one of the reasons he was so effective as an MIS guy. Some of that stuff, these stories you're trying to verify, that probably wasn't why it was in the film, but there was all evidence to point to that was going on. In fact, it was Masanosha, I think, that told us that story, but that's something you don't hear a whole lot about, that they were so mistreated in Japan.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you had heard that too, Seiki.
No, I haven't. I have not known any Kibe personally. So that's why I don't know that story. Yes. But the opposite is true. People who came back from Japan after their schooling there, the schools and their citizen and classmates in Hawaii really mistreated them because they can't speak straight English or pidgin English. The opposite effect happened to them. Yes.
Okay, let's come back. We'll come back to Kibe, but I have another question for you.
Okay.
From Lori Chieko. What prompted you to change your mind about telling these stories?
Well, I wasn't hiding it. It was there all along. You guys are asking the question. That's the reason I can answer now. But it's not the secrets. I won't tell you the secrets.
So you were just waiting for Bill and me to come over to your house and talk to you.
Okay. No.
All right, so let's see. And in the chat, Ben has a good book about the Kibe experience. You know, everybody, and it's addressed to everybody, so we can take a look at it in the chat. There's another one from Lonnie Bennett. My Kibe uncle taught at a Japanese language school in Hawaii and was therefore arrested on December 8th as an enemy alien, sent to a series of prisons, and then to Jerome and Tule Lake when his family joined him from Hawaii. Peter Ratchliff wants to know, how did descendants of MIS-LS experience interact with descendants of No-No Boy?
I have no experience of meeting a No-No Boy, member of that group.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of training you received at Camp Savage? Oh, well, you weren't in the schools here.
I was not there. I was not there at all.
But what Do you know what the classes were like? And was it just language study, or were there other classes, history, culture, etc.? How many hours of classes a day?
Well, it's from 8 till 5. It was a classes with lunch break and other breaks, but coming in a long list of training, period, in all forms of learning Japanese. It involved geography, reading and writing, speaking. And in some cases, they had some special training for Japanese government interactions.
I can just
Other than-
say, oh, what? Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, I would just say, my dad didn't specifically talk about that, but from what I've read, the classes evolved over time. The early first couple classes or so, they did teach Japanese history, religion, culture, all of this sort of thing. But then as they went on, they found that it was too much information. And then they restricted it more to just language and military terms, et cetera. And then towards the end of the war, after the Japan surrendered, then it became more civilian Japanese. So they kept, and then as the M.I.S. soldiers, some of them would come back from the front and say, oh, this is our experience there. And, these are the things that we found that you guys need to teach more. So it was constantly sort of evolving as to what the need was, depending on the time of the war.
And then if I'm correct, wasn't the M.I.S. information declassified in the Nixon administration?
Yeah, mid 70s is what I
Okay.
recall.
Here, Sally Sudo has a comment. My brother-in-law was Kibe, and he said his own Japanese relatives mistreated him because they resented the fact that they had another person to feed when they were suffering from food shortages themselves. Karen Matsumoto says, my dad, Roy Matsumoto, had an advantage when doing Japanese interpretation in Burma because he was able to speak and understand various Japanese dialects. Several of his fellow MISers in the Merrill's Marauders had trouble understanding the Kyushu dialect, which my dad understood. He learned it while delivering groceries to Japanese families in Los Angeles and picked up the dialect. Mark Matsunaga says, Seiki, how good was your Nihongo when you arrived in Japan? Must have been pretty good for someone who went to a plantation and didn't need to go to MISLS.
Yeah. How good was it? It was very poor. When we study Japanese 1 hour a day for 7 days a week, 6 days a week, sorry, you cannot learn all the intricacies of that language. But when we play with our playmates, we don't speak Japanese. We speak pidgin English. And that's the way we lived throughout the life. It was a very small part. The language, the Japanese language was very low on the totem pole, So that's the way it was with us.
Mm-hmm. Here's a comment from John Nishio. My uncle also told me he couldn't speak of his activities in Japan. He was an instructor, Kibe, named Frank Nishio, So he's on your list. He would be on your registry. Also, my uncle George Sakai lived in Minnesota, and Rasmussen took a shine to him. This is personal. Can be. Oh wait. Curious if you recall their names. Frank Nishio, does that sound familiar? 8,000. There's only 8,000 names you have to remember.
Yes.
All right, here's another one, Andy P. As I'm on the West Coast, thank you, Andy, thought to share a recent book on one of the camps at which Northwest Japanese Americans were interned in Minidoka, An Eye for Injustice. And there's a link in the chat if you're interested. Karen Matsumoto has another comment. Because my dad grew up in Hiroshima through high school, he attended Japanese ROTC and understood Japanese military commands. And that was how he saved his whole battalion. Roy Matsumoto, I mean, the Merrill's Marauders, those guys loved him because of that. Nika Yasui says, I just had a student read Uprooted by Albert Martin that touches on some of this for a young adult audience. Well, thank you, Yasui. Drusilla, your friend Seiki.
Yeah.
Seiki-san, can you tell us about you and Vicky driving to the St. Louis Records Depository in the early days of your research into identifying the M.I.S. LS graduates whose names were listed by surname and first initial only? That's a good
Yes.
question.
My wife and I drove to St. Louis, and without announcing our arrival, we asked to use the research room of that archives, and we were being pushed away for a while, but we talked the director into letting us sit down and look at something, and the guy finally agreed to let us sit down and look at it. And I said, let me have the directory for all the troops in Japan during the occupation. And he pulled out a big book, and I saw this Judge Advocate General directory. And I saw some of those names that I was familiar with when I was there in Japan. So I says, let me have these, you know. And he gave me a selection of those that I chose. And by the time I went through that, I hit the jackpot. It was the morning reports of the units that I saw there. Morning reports are very special Army reports. If a soldier goes for a temporary duty to another site, his sergeant types out a report that says, morning report, so-and-so, certain soldier, full name, serial number, unit name, is dispatched to a certain unit. And he gives all that type of information. And I found 6,000 of these out of that Judge Advocates General list. And that's how I got most of the Japan assignments. that the Niseis had. Remember, the fire in St. Louis burned most of the records of the discharge papers. And here I found a backdoor approach of finding Niseis who were in Japan during the occupation. It was a real good find. We made 3 trips to St. Louis to get it all out. So that's the story.
You know,
This was
Steve,
asked for.
yeah, I was just going to say that reminds me that so many of these stories were lost no matter what, because usually, you know, like at 442, they had unit history. They did this campaign. M.I.S, everybody spread out all over Asia. You know, individual stories were probably not recorded in that official way. You know, the records being burned. And then guys like Mashinosta, who's in our film, he was actually assigned to a British unit. So whatever he did was not even documented in the U.S. Army. He just was kind of handed over to the British, and you know, when the war is over, here's go back. So there's a lot of these stories that just, unless we talk to them, we would never hear them, and we only talked to a few people. So that's why this was kind of this whole story about lost history, and you know, get what you can, because a lot of it will never be known.
Yep.
I like and the lost history is important. The other thing I discovered about making the film was that these guys were not just people that you read about in a book, although some of them were written about. But then once you meet them, you know, they're just like everyone else, and they have lives, they have personalities, and sense of humor too, which Bill had to look through a lot of footage to find that, but it was there, and that made it really interesting. And then if you watch the film, you know, there's these little nuggets of that come out.
Yeah.
And Seiki, I don't want to embarrass you, but Karen had a nice thing to say. So she said she didn't want to interrupt you. She wanted to just communicate through the chat because you're so adorable. It goes back to what
Okay.
Peter was saying about you on camera. That you're the one. I mean, and that was the thing that was so interesting to me, is that you were the main you're the main subject of the film, and you had the most personality of everybody, I think, and so that really carried the film, I think, your appearance.
Wow.
Let's see, I have another question. This is from Krista Hansen. She's a historian in St. Paul, in Minnesota. Approximately how many World War II fallen soldiers were there in the M.I.S.L.S? There were about 400,000 total during the war.
The question is, how many fell in
Yes,
Niseis?
M.I.S.L.S. MISers.
MIS. Well, we made a very special effort to compile all the killed in action and both battle and non-battle type of lists. And there is a file that shows that. I got to look it up and publish it, I guess. Huh? We sent it out long ago too.
Okay.
There was one. There was like a
Um,
plane crash. We lost a few guys in one particular incident, right? That's what I was aware of. And then
yeah.
there are
That's
cases here. They're
right.
like Frank Achia is one of the most important parts of our film. He was killed in action, and we told his story.
There was a group
Yeah.
of linguists being transported from Manila to Okinawa en route to be sent to Tokyo. And then when they reached Okinawa, the crazy kamikaze people began giving out the alarm, and the plane crashed and they killed 10 linguists, one shot. Yeah, that happened. I knew about that story.
Okay. Although that's Andy P. Has another book suggestion. Although it's a bit distant from Minnesota, another recent book recounts a small Yamato colony in Florida, not subject to internment, but maybe less severe discrimination. So you can look at that in the chat. This is from Toru Shinoda. Thank you for this important event for not only American people, but also Japanese people. The history of Japanese American has been missed in post-war Japan. We should know more of it and teach younger Japanese about it. In fact, my university had a special school for children who were born in other countries and sent to Japan in late 1930s. My student opened the history a little bit. Toru, can you tell us where you teach? That would be interesting. And then Peggy Doy, just wanted to clarify, Bill Doy is not related to Terry Doy, but they were both in the M.I.S. and Bill Doy was stationed here in Minnesota. Mark Matsunaga, thank you all. Thank you to all involved in today's program, and especially to Seiki for all the work on the registry. Without it, M.I.S. descendants would be lost.
Hey, Seiki, there was a couple other people you worked with on the registry. Grant, right?
Right.
Aiko, right?
Right.
Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig, who you hear in
Correct.
other realms of Japanese American history, you know?
Aiko was the archivist for the Commission on Relocation of Civilians. And she really had a big file.
Yeah, if you look her up, she's like one of the more important people in terms of related to modern Japanese American history. And it's just, to me, it's kind of coincidental, but I guess inevitable that she was going to be in our film. We just ran out of room, but we interviewed her too in LA.
Oh. She turned over her file over to some university. You guys know that?
Yeah, she told us about that.
Yeah.
I think that's it for the questions. I'd just like to acknowledge my partner, Brenda Kazar. She helped us a lot during this whole time of making the film. She was a good sounding board for us. And then Bill's wife, Sharon. And I think Patty is online too, and Yoshiko. or Toby, I mean, is Bill's mom. So thank you everybody for joining us. You know, and you can look at our Facebook page. It's the Registry 1941. And if you're looking for a relative that might have been in M.I.S, you can take a look at that, and I'll post that again for everybody to look at. And Seiki, do you have anything you wanted to say?
Well, we went off on a tangent. And really, that's too bad. But anyway, if I were to go through the my notes, we could do it some more, right?
We'll have to do it. We'll have to plan another one of these.
It's too bad that I don't know how to do the what was it? Like Karen Lucas did that what's that technique called?
Oh yeah, PowerPoint. Yeah.
PowerPoint.
Yeah.
I wish I knew how to do PowerPoint.
I think this
somebody
was a
got to
good.
help me do that.
Yeah, I think this was a good way to do it because there were some good questions here.
Yeah.
We should say Seiki was one of the pioneers in the big mainframe computers back in the day, right? You're a computer guy. It's
You
just
are.
these home computers are a pain, right?
Yes. I worked on mainframe computers, big ones, you know. It costs something like $6 million or greater.
Here,
with
let me just
control
read
data.
these. Let me just read these thank yous to you, Seiki. Thank you, everyone. This is very important. This is from Krista. This is very important to continue to share these stories and honor and remember this day. Thank you for your time and efforts. Thank you for a fascinating panel. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to be able to interact with Seiki, Steve, and Bill. A wonderful and informative program. Thank you. It was wonderful hearing all these stories directly from Seiki and everyone else. Here's one from my sister. My sister Judy, thank you for a great presentation. Seiki, you are amazing. So Peter, did you want to say anything?
I wondered if Carolyn Nyamatsu wanted to say something about what might be coming up at Fort Snelling or what you're working on. We have other opportunities to share and tell and listen to these stories coming up. Carolyn, I know you weren't expecting this, but would you mind saying a little bit?
I think Vinny, I believe Vinny is, where you were going to close, Vinny, with some of our upcoming things.
Oh, great.
Is that true, Vinny?
I mean, sure. You would be the expert, being a part of the education committee that plans it all. But yeah, for those who are interested in learning more, we're going to be hosting the Righting a Wrong Japanese Americans in World War II Smithsonian exhibit at the Minnesota History Center. And that'll be going from April 23rd to July 3rd. And we're going to have some pretty exciting programming and receptions along with that. The main event, I believe, is we're going to have Dale Minami coming to speak on May 21st. And he was a big part of the movement for redress following World War II. Did that about cover it, Carolyn, or anything else you want to add?
Well, Vinny is working on, so we'll have Dale Minami come. we're going to have another panel discussion of MIS descendants. Karen and Peggy, Matt Abe will be a part, and Kimi Tanaka, who's here, who did a video on the MIS. We will also be showing, MHS will be showing the film, and then they came for us. And then our final program is something Vinny is working on. It will be the connection between, most of the camps, or many of the camps were on Native American land. And there is a film that has just will be, I guess, released called Manzanar Diverted. And it's going to be, we'll show the film, and then Vinny and gang are working on a collaboration between us and the Native American community about the camps being on Native American land. And I believe the film is about water rights. So we're going to be bringing contemporary issues coming up as well. And that's one of the big ones, is we don't talk too much about how the camps were on Native American land and how the Native Americans felt about the camps being there. So there is that connection coming up. So I guess, thank you, everybody, and back to Peter. And
I have one more thing.
okay.
So here's something that's really good that came out of this Zoom meeting. Nico Yasui just offered to help Seiki with a PowerPoint presentation. So you guys can.
Great.
So I'll connect you guys, you two, and I'd love to see what you come up with.
Great. There was a question, Steve and Bill, how long might the link remain available for people to watch the film if they didn't watch it before today?
Bill, how long do you want to keep that up?
I don't know. I'll keep it up until I remember I should take it down.
So that link is in the Eastside Freedom Library event page for today, which will stay available. And we will be posting a video of today's presentation and conversation on our YouTube page. I want to thank my colleague Bailey Ethier for handling the tech today. And I just want to mention in passing this issue that Carolyn has brought up about intersections between Native Americans and Japanese Americans, that we recently had a college student at the Eastside Freedom Library doing research on a Native American painter, an Ojibwe painter named Raymond Desjarlais, who came from the Red Lake Reservation in Minnesota. And in 1943, he went to Camp Poston to teach visual art to some of the people and the children who were incarcerated there. And she wrote a lovely appreciation of Desjarlais and his intersection with Japanese Americans during World War II. I know also that we continue to do work at the Eastside Freedom Library with local African Americans around the issue of reparations for African Americans. And they are very interested in learning more about how Japanese Americans organized and were able to get redress and reparations in 1988. And so I think that's a subject that we will also be paying attention to in the future. I want to thank Carolyn and Karen and Vinny and Steve and Bill and Seiki and everybody else who contributed to making this happen today. And as a professional historian, I'm so appreciative of Seiki's work. We recently had a little program with a former student who works at the Smithsonian, who heads a committee of 6 staff people at the Smithsonian with the task of what they're calling decolonizing the archives. And I think that the work that Seiki has done to create this registry is just a wonderful example of what it means to approach history in a decolonizing way. to take responsibility, not just for telling the stories, but also for compiling the documents that enable us and others to tell the stories. So this was great today. Thank you all. Stay warm, stay well, stay safe.